With Agile Lens here, so he'll present the final presentation for the night, and then afterwards we'll have a slight reception for another 20 or 30 minutes, and you guys can experience some of the VR stuff that they have set up, and then we can move on to continue discussion at the bar. So I'll leave it to Alex, and you can take it from here.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Thanks, guys, for sticking around this long. I think this is the latest at night I've ever given a presentation. I hope it's worth it. We're going to do kind of a high-level overview. I'm calling this presentation Drawing with Z, Enhancing Your Design Process with VR, and I'm realizing that my font did not come with this presentation, so hopefully we don't have too much text just like falling off the page. We'll see. So my name is Alex Coulombe. I talk very fast. Sorry about that in advance. And I'm the creative director of Agile Lens Immersive Design. And before I even get started with what we'll be covering in this very high-level overview, 15 minutes, how many of you guys have any idea what's going on here? Just raise your hand if you're like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Cool, great, yeah, that's like half of you, that's good. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just want to give a little bit of a distinction between what we typically call VR, which would be, all the headsets that you see people putting on that have a wire that are hooked into a computer, you're covering your face, you're in a totally digital world, versus something like AR, which you might be doing with your phone if you're playing Pokemon Go, or your tablet, or HoloLens, or some of you might have heard of Magic Leap, which is now being called something more like mixed reality. So there's kind of that spectrum. Then over here you've got like Google Cardboard and some of the more portable things you can use with your phone. And then I felt like I needed to put something down in this quadrant. Not many people are doing this, but you can use like the webcam on your computer and throw a digital model down, and I guess you can call that like desktop AR. And yeah, why not, right? Just to
WebXR coming, so that's not.
That's right, thank you. And I was just about to say XR. Damn all these terms, because I thought it would be easy and we'd just have VR as kind of the overall encompassing term for all these different technologies. And then it was like, no, VR really is kind of just this. And then XR, and some people are even calling XR cross reality, like that's kind of now being seen as the catch-all. But if you hear me talking about virtual reality during this presentation, a lot of times I'm talking about augmented reality or other things, so don't worry about it. No one has figured out what is going on now. And really, to make things even more confusing, Microsoft decided to call their new VR headsets Windows Mixed Reality. It's not mixed reality. It's awful and confusing, but I hope we can get past that together. I find a lot of times this almost ends up being like a support group. So that being said, Agile Lens Immersive Design. So my company grew out of a architecture theater consultancy called Fisher Dax Associates, and so I spent several years designing theaters, and I've always been interested in new technology. Back when I was doing my thesis, I was using very early augmented reality back in 2008. And I've always had this passion for using new and emerging technologies to improve design, to make design more efficient, and to make everyone more confident in what you're doing. And part of that came from the fact that I wasn't a very good draftsman and model maker in school, and so I was always looking for another way to help my professors understand all the crazy things going on in my head that I knew were really good ideas, but I didn't quite have the tools to make that clear. And so I struggle sometimes with how to define our company. Kind of the easiest analogy is to say we're sort of the VR equivalent of like if you were to hire an MEP consultant, or even on the other end of the spectrum, like a rendering studio to do some really nice animations, because we find ourselves both on the consulting side, helping companies shepherd a project, sometimes from the beginning, from initial concepts, through project completion, sometimes just at checkpoints along the way where they're like, hey, we got a big presentation coming up in 2 weeks. Can you make an immersive experience that shows these 3 design options and has a daylight study and can make us win everyone's hearts and minds, that kind of thing. And then sometimes people are just like, we've got a big marketing push, make something that's pretty, it doesn't need to do anything special. So various projects, huzzah, happy to talk about any of those in more detail. But the goal that I find for immersive technology, I find this stuff fun. Before I was getting paid to do this, I was just doing this in 4 a.m. in the morning because I thought it was cool. But the reason we have a company now here is because the point of this is to save everyone time, money, make everyone more confident in what you're doing. And so, as fun as it is, the goal is ultimately to make this a net gain, to make everyone's lives easier. Because I think we've all encountered people in our field that don't know how to read a plan or a section or an elevation or even a rendering sometimes. And so virtual reality at its very base level is a way to just get everyone on the same page, to drop everyone into a world where they feel like they're there and you all can say, oh yeah, that's a terrible idea, we shouldn't do that. And then you can make progress from there. So meetings can get a lot shorter. And that's a nice quote that I just like to throw up there sometimes, very catchy. I didn't come up with it. But when you start to think about how VR can be used throughout the design process, every bullet point here could be a 2-hour presentation. And I'm happy to do that if anyone wants to for any of these someday. But I think what's most useful to focus on right now in this kind of high-level way is kind of these 3 core categories that we can think of VR being useful for in the design process. And so I think of that as quick review, and that's one-click options. We'll go through those in a second. Custom experiences where you need something that's a little bit more tailored. And my big evangelical thing that I'm always pushing for is actually drawing and designing and thinking inside of VR as you work through a creative process. So the quick review side. A lot of you guys are already using Revit, 3ds Max, BIM programs, Navisworks, things where you already need to be thinking about some of these categories, and sometimes you're even producing renderings from that. And so the first way I try to get people introduced to VR, if they're not using it that much, is to help them understand that it's really just an extension of what they're already doing in their workflow. So if you're already doing this much, then it's kind of a little hop, skip, and a jump over to doing something like 360 stereo panoramas, or even an experience you can walk around in. And then at that point, there's a lot of different platforms you can get that out to. You can make a VR experience, especially with WebVR, WebXR, WebAR, all that, that is going to be accessible to people who don't even have the right device. They can still use their finger or click around on their browser to see everything that's there. They just don't get to be fully immersed. And so we're starting with this idea of drag and drop. WebVR, as you know, the case may be in this case. This is a company I've worked with called Visor that just has a very intuitive system for literally dropping any 360 or cube maps or stereo renders you might have into your browser and building a tour very fast. And that can be to help you go through design options. It can be to help you go through the tour of a project. And that's just a quick and very easy way to review. And again, these images can be coming right from Revit or whatever software you're in. And that can have branding and all sorts of things. And then drag and drop desktop VR. So this is all about the kind of one-click solution things. Also, I just found out today, of course, that like these guys belong in this category. So that's cool. I just got to try out the software and it's really fantastic. So I'm happy to include these among all the other options. The video, I'll just tell you, is actually something that happened again tonight where Insight VR has started hosting these, they're calling them immersive project showcases, where they bring in an architect who's finished a project and they open it up on their platform, and then everyone who's there, people from all over the world, get to tour that project together while the architect talks about their design decisions. So that's a way to, you know, help everyone understand how a design made it to where it is. And to be able to do that from people all over the world is a really phenomenal thing. In this particular case too, I think the architect actually ended up winning a new project because there was someone there who wanted a similar kind of project, and we're like, oh yeah, this guy clearly knows what he's talking about. So that was pretty neat. So yeah, so this is an example of more custom experiences now, right? So in this particular example, this is a theater that started in VR from very early concept phase, and now it's in CA, and we're still using VR for it for a lot of different reasons. But this is an example of using a very custom workflow to show off and learn about what we needed to at a given time. So this is the Vive tracking puck, and we started using the tracking puck to actually put real objects inside virtual space. So we had a 3D model of this Eames chair, and we were using that to test out some different sight lines. We didn't actually populate the theater with 1,200 Eames chairs, but it was a way to kind of decide which sightline positions were working and which ones weren't. And then also what you're seeing here is a toggling from the Revit model into also a SketchUp model. So because this has been in VR since the very earliest phases, it's a really cool thing to be in VR and cycling through the entire design process and seeing how the design has evolved over time. Real quick, this is formerly the Culture Shed, now the Shed. We were doing this with DSR and Rockwell Group, and this is like early Oculus Rift DK1 days, and this was a cool, very specific use case of VR where we just needed to have something for a presentation like the next day, and so I grabbed, you know, some people, a guy who would walk around. I put a 4-foot stick in there and a 7-foot stick in there because those were the clearance heights we needed for certain kinds of equipment, and we got everyone in there walking around, and we said, this fits, this doesn't fit. We marked everything on the key plan up there in the upper right, and it was like, okay, that took no time at all. It's messy, but it did exactly what we needed it to. So those kinds of custom solutions can be really fun. This was for the Late Show Stephen Colbert. That was just a cool thing I like to show off, where we figured out how many projectors they needed for the top of the Ed Sullivan Dome. That was a very quick turnaround time. And then this is kind of transitioning into my favorite topic, sketching in VR. And so this is an example, some of you saw the demo on our Daydream phone over there, starting in something like a tilt brush sketch. And this is all 360 images at first. It was a while before this was built out into a full VR space. And we're basically cycling between all these different versions of this lobby area, because at first it was just about getting a sense of how daylight was coming in. Then we did one material option, then another. And then eventually they're like, you know what, we got our own interior design department. Why don't you, from a Daydream mobile headset, throw in some abilities that would actually move our furniture around and let our interior designers go wild. And I was like, please, let's just do this on an Oculus or a Vive. And they said, no. And I said, okay. And that's how we ended up with this. So, my favorite topic for sketching. So, the thing that I think people don't seem to understand is that it's really not that hard to go from drawing on a flat 2D surface to drawing in VR. This is my 2-year-old, and he's a phenomenal VR sketcher. He didn't do that, I'll full disclosure. But it's really not that hard, and every time I can get a really talented designer into a program like Tilt Brush or Gravity Sketch or some of these other immersive tools, it's really wonderful to watch them light up as they start to realize, like, oh, this isn't like learning Revit or some new piece of software where there's menus and shortcuts and 1,000 little, idiosyncrasies like learning the English language or something like that. It's very much like going back to drawing with your hand, which a lot of us who come into a design discipline like architecture, that's what we like to doing at first. We like doing things with our hands, and sometimes when you're stuck in a program like Revit, that can start to feel very disconnected. So a great joy of going into VR has been to show people what it's like again to be, using your hands and working through a design process that way. This here is a program called Masterpiece VR, and this allows you to actually draw and sketch and talk with people at the same time in a very collaborative way. So this was a guy I met in like an architecture Reddit forum, and we just started talking about how we like drawing in VR, so we hopped in there and made something together, which was pretty cool. Now, revision drawing. So I'm sure we've all gotten to a point where we've been in, say, a Revit model, and you're like, you know what, we gotta go through the next phase in this. Maybe you're going from SD to DD, or there's just an area that hasn't been worked out yet, and maybe you might use trace paper or a sketchbook to kind of work through what you want to do. And my whole thing is, like, I try to get people to start thinking, again, there's that sketch my 2-year-old did, to think about working out what they want to do by drawing. Now, of course, seeing this in 2D is no substitute for being in VR, but it's a really phenomenal way to start to work through these ideas yourself. So it's for you, and then also to communicate what you want to do to others. So if your boss is like, that's a terrible idea, throw and burn all your sketching tools, sometimes you can put him in a headset and he won't tell you to burn that because that's more expensive, but also there's a way for you to communicate to them what your design intention is, and they're going to understand the human experience, the human scale, what it's like much better than a traditional medium might. So here's just a quick example of this one project. Bring your section box into a program like Tilt Brush. So in this case, the exterior had kind of been worked out, and we started drawing inside to just work out some of the interior moves we wanted to do. Okay, and then what's cool in Tilt Brush is it remembers your stroke order. So every line you draw, it's keeping a record of that, and then you can actually have it recreated in real time, so someone can watch something you might have spent a few days drawing just get rebuilt in 30 seconds, which is pretty neat. So then from there, you can take that sketch and basically treat that the same way you would treat a red line or some kind of trace paper overlay, and you can bring that into another program. In this case, this is Unreal Engine, and then you can start to build out more of the design. This is kind of an optional step. I'd call this advanced. What you could do is be taking this directly into Revit or 3ds Max, which is the next slide, but I'm kind of wild like this, so I brought this into Unreal Engine to start thinking about lighting and materials and geometry, so I started to mass everything out and try different things out very quickly. What if this was wood? What if this was concrete? What if this was some kind of brick material? And sometimes you try something out and go, that's a terrible idea, let's not do that, and then you're done 5 seconds later, much faster than doing a rendering or a sketch before you realize that you need to move on from there. And then from here, though, what we get to do, placing some furniture, placing some geometry, having a good time with that. Next slide is then bringing all of this into whatever program you're in. So sometimes, I know people are doing more in 3ds Max, but I think the crowd here is mostly Revit. And so then you can import whatever you've done, whether it's just the sketch or some other geometry that maybe you masked out in VR, into your design program of choice, and then again, treat that like trace paper, a red line, something like that. But you have a 3D representation of it, so then you have the opportunity to build out the more precise version. I would never tell anyone to be drawing construction documents in VR. That would be exhausting and incredibly frustrating, but it's a great way to, same way you would use a sketchbook, work through an idea and then deal with the more precise version of it later. So you get through that whole design process in a much more confident and fun way, really. It is fun. And so this is kind of what we get to, is this, this workflow. Again, game engine part being kind of optional, but having your modeling software, bringing whatever you are working on at the moment into some kind of VR design software, maybe into a game engine if you want to start massing things out, playing with lighting and materials, back in your modeling software to make it into something more precise, and then kind of rinsing and repeating. That arrow got bigger. That's weird. I don't know why that happened. So this question I like to tell designers to start asking themselves is, oh, am I at a point right now where maybe it would be good to try doing this in VR? And the answer, kind of at its barest bones, is if you otherwise would be trying something in a sketchbook or on trace paper, I'd say, yeah, try to do the equivalent but in VR, and don't spend a lot of time on it. At first there might be a little bit of a learning curve, but I'm at the point now where when I'm doing this kind of stuff, I'm in VR for 5 to 10 minutes, taking about the same amount of time I might be taking with a sketch, and then I can cycle it back in and I have much more information about the human experience. So this is a project I like to show as kind of a conception to completion encompassment of all of this. And so I started, I take the train up to the Hudson Valley. I live up by Cold Spring, and looking at the Hudson Valley every day, I just started to imagine some kind of spot that I would like to put on a little hillside that I pass by on the train. And so with that in mind, I got hopped in Tilt Brush, started drawing just a little pavilion house, whatever we might want to call it. And again, here it is being recreated in real time. And from there, we'll skip over to this part. Basically, the idea here being that we started in Tilt Brush, I had a sketch, I brought it into Unreal Engine. I did this entire design process from within VR. So from the sketch, I went into Unreal Engine and masked everything out. I did the materials in there, I did the lighting, I did the fire and the water, and really got to play with what I wanted to do with this. This is a demo we have available tonight if you want to take a look or have already. And then at the end of it, of course, there was very quick to do different design options to just cycle through, but then also, this is just a plate with apples on it, but to move furniture around and just walk around the space as though you're very strong and wanted to just see what different interior design options might be like. So that can be very satisfying. I think what I'm about to do here is start throwing a chair around. It's amazing how many people inside an experience like this either just wreck the place and have a blast doing it, or if they accidentally knock something over, they're like, oh my god, I'm so sorry. They feel really bad about it. So you learn a lot about people inside these experiences. And then what I'm going back to here is that once you've created a very robust VR experience, it's very quick to start to move it to these different platforms. We mentioned WebVR, so in the upper right, that's just running in a web browser. You could all open that on your phone right now and feel like you're in VR. The desktop VR experience requires something more robust. This is Tilt Brush again, and then a mobile VR experience that maybe is using something like Daydream or Gear VR to approximate the higher fidelity experience, but making it more accessible. Now, by the way, you guys can take a picture of this. This is just a useful quick slide for, I like how some of the text overrun, sculpting, multi-use GUR. But these are some of the programs out there, and you'll see they're not very expensive. VR is actually, the price has dropped phenomenally fast as the hardware is improving. So you can get a headset now for $200. The software to start drawing and starting to work through a design process in VR is not very expensive, and that's very useful. What I was going to say about the last thing was some people, I'll tell them about this whole proof of concept design I did for my little happy house on the Hudson. I'd never said that before and had all those H's aligned. That was fun. And they say, well, Alex, that's really cool, but you're not going to take that now and bring it into Revit and turn it into a real project, so that's kind of useless. And I say, first of all, you're very mean. Please don't be friends with me anymore. And then I say, but here's something very interesting. I'm spending a lot of time in virtual worlds these days, and there is very quickly becoming a thirst for good design inside virtual reality environments. And I'm talking about these bigger social worlds, Altspace, High Fidelity, Sanzar. There's going to be better ones, I think, coming. But there's a lot of experiences and spaces in there that feel like they were designed by people with CS degrees, not people with any kind of design background. And as people are spending more and more time in these environments, they're becoming thirstier, hungrier, whatever craving analogy you want to use, for spaces that feel well thought out. And so there is an opportunity here for real designers working in the built environment to start to translate some of their skills into virtual environments, making projects that will never be constructed but will receive a lot of use. And so this is something I'm trying to get more people to think about. And there are some opportunities for this now, but before long you'll find there will be people saying, hey, we will pay $50,000, whatever, for someone to build this particular virtual experience that we know 2 million people a year are going to use, and we want our company to be proud of that. So that's kind of where we're headed. I think that's it. Belay, oh yeah, I was going to say, this, there's these projects that have, for forever, that go back, where they were never intended to be constructed, and it's interesting that now we can construct them in virtual reality. So there we are. Thanks, guys. Happy to talk about this stuff, as you can tell. Kind of passionate about it.